Welcome once again to Cherish Ephesians 6:4, and we're reading Confessions in Modern Updated English. This is Book 5. Accept my confession spoken from my tongue that you created and inspired to honor your name. Heal all my wounds and let them declare, O Lord, who is like you? When I confess to you, I am not telling you anything new because you already know what's in my heart. Even if my heart is closed, it doesn't block your sight, and no amount of stubbornness can push away your hand. You can soften it with your will, whether in compassion or in punishment, and nothing can hide from your warmth. But let my soul praise you so that it can love you, and let it acknowledge your kindness so that it can glorify you. Your entire creation never stops praising you, whether it's the human spirit speaking to you, or the living and non-living things through the voices of those who contemplate them. In this way, our souls can find rest in you, leaning on the things you've created and moving towards you, the one who made them wonderfully. In you there is comfort and true strength. Let those who are restless and godless run away from you, but you still see them, and you separate the darkness. And look, the universe is beautiful with them in it, even though they are not. How have they harmed you? Or have they tarnished your rule, which is fair and flawless from the heavens to the lowest earth? Where could they run to escape your presence? Where could they go where you would not find them? They ran away so they wouldn't have to see you seeing them, and in their blindness they tripped over you, because you never abandon anything you've created. The unjust, tripped over you and were rightly hurt. They pulled away from your kindness, stumbled over your fairness, and fell on their own rough edges. They truly didn't realize that you are everywhere, and no place can contain you. And you alone are close even to those who push you away. So let them turn around and look for you, because you haven't abandoned your creation like they have abandoned their Creator. Let them turn around and look for you, and see, you are there in their heart, in the heart of those who admit to you and throw themselves on you and cry on your shoulder after all their rough journeys. Then you gently wipe away their tears and they cry even more and find joy in crying, because you, Lord, not a human made from flesh and blood, but you, Lord, who created them, recreate and comfort them. But where was I when I was looking for you? And you were right there in front of me, but I had walked away from you. I couldn't even find myself, let alone you. I want to share with you about my 29th year. At that time, a certain bishop of the Manichees named Faustus came to Carthage. He was a major trap set by the devil, and his smooth talking ensnared many. While I admired his eloquence, I was able to separate it from the truth I was eager to learn. I wasn't so much interested in his speaking skills as I was in the knowledge that his highly praised Faustus presented to me. He had a reputation for being incredibly knowledgeable and highly skilled in the liberal arts. Having read and remembered a lot from the philosophers, I compared their ideas with the long-winded stories of the Manichees. I found the philosophers' ideas more believable, even though they could only make judgments about this physical world, and couldn't figure out who the Lord was. You are great, Lord, and you pay attention to the humble, but you keep your distance from the proud. You only draw close to those who are humble and contrite in heart. Even if the proud could count the stars and the grains of the sand, measure the heavens and track the planets' paths with their clever skills, they wouldn't find you. With the intelligence and the wit you've given them, they've explored these mysteries. They've discovered a lot and even predicted eclipses of the sun and moon years in advance. They knew the exact day, hour, and extent of these eclipses, and their predictions were on spot. They recorded their findings, and these records are still used today to predict when and how much of the sun or moon will be eclipsed in the future. And these predictions always turn out to be accurate. People who don't understand this science are amazed and bewildered, while those who do are thrilled and filled with pride. But in their arrogance, they've turned away from you. They can predict that when the sun's light will fail, but they can't see their own failures. They don't consider where their intelligence comes from. Even when they realize that you're the source, they don't dedicate themselves to you or appreciate what you've created. They don't sacrifice their own creations or tame their wild imaginations and curiosities. They don't control their desires like animals in the wild. But you, Lord, can burn away their dead concerns and give them eternal life. They didn't understand the way, your word, by which you created all these things they count, and even themselves who do the counting, and the senses they use to perceive what they count, and the understanding they use to count. They didn't realize that your wisdom is infinite. But your only Son is our wisdom, righteousness, and sanctification, and he lived among us, even paying taxes to Caesar. They didn't know how to find him within themselves, and through him find you. They thought they were high and mighty like the stars in the sky, but they fell to earth and their foolish hearts were clouded. They talk a lot about the creation, but they don't earnestly seek the truth, the creator of all things, so they don't find you. And even if they do recognize you as God, they don't glorify you or show gratitude. Instead, they become vain in their thoughts and claim to be wise, taking credit for what is yours. In their twisted blindness, they try to blame you for their faults. They lie about you, the embodiment of truth, and degrade your uncorruptible glory into images of corruptible humans, birds, animals, and insects. They twist your truth into lies, worshiping and serving the creation more than the Creator. I learned a lot about the universe from these people, and I understood their reasoning through calculations, the passage of time, and the observable evidence of the stars. I compared this with what Manichaeus had written in his madness on these subjects. However, I found no mention of solstices, equinoxes, or eclipses of the sun and moon, or anything else I had learned in my secular philosophy books. Yet I was told to believe it. But it didn't match up with what I had figured out through calculations and my own observations. In fact, it was completely the opposite. So, Lord God of truth, does knowing these things please you? Surely anyone who knows all these things but doesn't know you is unfortunate. But anyone who knows you, even if they don't know these things, is fortunate. And anyone who knows both you and these things isn't happier because of these things, but only because of you. That is, if they recognize you as God, express gratitude, and don't become arrogant in their thoughts. Just like someone who knows how to use a tree and thanks you for it is better off, even if they don't know its exact height or width, compared to someone who can measure it and count all its branches, but doesn't own it or know or love its creator. Similarly, a believer who owns all the wealth in this world and who, by sticking to you, possesses everything even if they don't know the constellations, is undoubtedly in a better state than someone who can measure the heavens, count the stars, balance the elements, but ignores you, the creator of everything, who has made everything with precision and balance. So who told Manichaeus to write about these things when having knowledge about them doesn't make you any more pious? You've told us, God, that piety and wisdom are what matter. Even if someone knew everything about these worldly things, they could still be ignorant of piety and wisdom. And Manichaeus, who didn't even know these things but had the audacity to teach them, clearly didn't understand piety at all. It's pointless to brag about worldly knowledge, but confessing to you, God, is a sign of piety. Manichaeus talked a lot about these worldly things, so that when he was proven wrong by those who actually knew them, it would be clear how little he understood about more complex matters. He didn't want to be seen as ordinary, but tried to convince people that the Holy Ghost, the comforter and enricher of your faithful ones, was personally within him with full authority. So when he was caught teaching false things about the heavens, stars, and the movements of the sun and moon, even though these things aren't related to religious teachings, his blasphemous arrogance became clear. He was not only ignorant of these things, but he also lied about them with such crazy vanity and pride, trying to attribute them to himself as if he were a divine being. When I come across a fellow Christian who's not aware of these things and has misconceptions about them, I can tolerate his views. I don't think being uninformed about the physical world's nature or structure can harm him, as long as he doesn't believe anything that disrespects you, Lord, the creator of everything. However, it does harm him if he thinks it's related to religious doctrine and insists on it, even though he doesn't fully understand it. But even this weakness is tolerated by our Mother Charity in the early stages of faith, until the believer matures and isn't swayed by every new teaching. But if someone claims to be a teacher, a leader, a guide, convincing others to follow him as if he were not just a man, but your Holy Spirit, Lord, wouldn't we all agree that such arrogance, once proven wrong, should be condemned and completely rejected? At that time, I wasn't sure if the changes in the length of days and nights, eclipses, and other phenomena I'd read about in other books could be reconciled with his teachings. If they could, I would still question whether his explanations were correct. But because of his reputation for holiness, I was inclined to trust his authority. For nearly all of those 9 years, when my mind was in turmoil, I was their student. I was eagerly awaiting the arrival of this Faustus. The rest of the group, whom I happened to meet, couldn't answer my questions about certain things, but they kept promising me that Faustus would soon arrive. They assured me that he could easily and thoroughly clear up these and even more complex issues, if I had any. When he finally arrived, I found him to be a charming conversationalist, who could express himself well and in a more refined manner, but he was just repeating the same things they usually said. But what good was the most polished presentation when I was thirsty for more substantial knowledge? I was already tired of hearing the same things, and they didn't seem any better to me just because they were expressed more eloquently. They didn't seem true just because they were eloquent, nor did the speaker seem wise just because he was good-looking and spoke gracefully. But those who had recommended him to me weren't very good at judging these things. To them he seemed knowledgeable and wise because he was pleasing to listen to. However, I noticed that some people were even skeptical of the truth and wouldn't accept it if it was presented in a smooth and elaborate speech. But you, my God, had already taught me in amazing and mysterious ways. I believe that you taught me because it is the truth, and there is no other teacher of truth but you, no matter where or how it is revealed. So I had learned from you that something shouldn't seem true just because it's eloquently expressed, nor false because the words are awkward. Similarly, it shouldn't seem true just because it's bluntly stated, nor false because the language is sophisticated. Wisdom and foolishness are like healthy and unhealthy food, and polished or plain words are like fine or simple dishes. Either kind of content can be served in either kind of language. That intense anticipation I had for so long to meet this man was truly satisfied by his debating skills, his choice of words, and his ability to express his thoughts. I was thrilled, and along with many others, I praised and admired him more than anyone else. However, I was bothered by the fact that I couldn't ask him my burning questions during his public talks. When I finally got the chance to talk to him privately with my friends, at times when it was appropriate for him to engage in discussions with me, I started to see a different side of him. I realized that he didn't have much knowledge in liberal sciences except for basic grammar. But because he had read some of Cicero's speeches, a few books by Seneca, some poetry, and a few well-written Latin books from his own philosophical school, and because he practiced speaking daily, he had developed a certain eloquence. This eloquence was even more charming and persuasive because it was guided by his intelligence and natural grace. Isn't this how I remember it, my God, the judge of my conscience? You know what is in my heart and in my memory. You were the one who guided me at that time through your mysterious providence, and made me see my shameful mistakes so that I could recognize and despise them. After realizing he didn't know much about the subjects I thought he was an expert in, I started to lose hope that he could help me solve the problems that were bothering me. Even though he didn't know much, he could have still understood the truths of piety if he hadn't been a Manichee. Their books are full of long-winded myths about the heavens, stars, sun, and moon, and I no longer believed he could help me decide what I really wanted to know, whether the explanations in the Manichee books were better, or at least as good as the ones I had read elsewhere. When I suggested we discuss and analyze this, he modestly backed away from the challenge. He knew he didn't know these things and wasn't too proud to admit it. He wasn't like those talkative people I had to put up with who promised to teach me these things but ended up saying nothing. This person had a heart. Even though he wasn't completely aligned with you, he wasn't entirely dishonest with himself either. He knew what he didn't know and didn't want to get caught up in a debate he couldn't get out of or handle properly. I actually liked him more for this. His modesty was more attractive than the knowledge of those things I wanted to know. And in all the more complex and subtle questions, I found him to be just like this. My passion for Manashaw's writings started to fade, and I became even more disillusioned with their other teachers. This was especially after realizing that even their most esteemed teacher couldn't answer my complex questions. I started studying literature with him, a subject he was also passionate about, and which I was teaching to young students in Carthage at the time. We would read together either what he wanted to hear or what I thought would suit his intellect. However, all my efforts to progress in that sect came to a halt after getting to know him. It's not that I completely cut ties with them, but I decided to be content with what I had stumbled upon, unless something better came along. So, Faustus, who was a trap of death for many, unknowingly started to free me from the trap I was in. But God, you never abandoned me. Your secret plans continue to guide my soul. My mother's constant prayers and tears were a sacrifice offered to you on my behalf, and you worked in mysterious ways in my life. You did it, God. For a man's steps are directed by the Lord, and he establishes his path. How else can we achieve salvation if not from your hand, reshaping what it created? You convinced me to go to Rome and teach there instead of Carthage. I won't forget to thank you for this, because it's a testament to your deep wisdom and your constant kindness. I didn't want to go to Rome because my friends promised me more money and prestige there, although I won't lie, that did sway me a bit. The main reason I wanted to go was because I heard the students there were more serious and disciplined. They didn't just barge into classes they weren't enrolled in, or even allowed in without the teacher's permission. In contrast, the students at Carthage were out of control. They rudely interrupt classes with their wild behavior, completely disregarding any rules set for their benefit. They'd commit all sorts of outrageous acts which would be punishable by law if it weren't for the fact that it had become the norm. This made them even more pitiful because they thought they were getting away with their actions when in reality, their very ignorance was their punishment, and it was far worse than anything they were doing. As a teacher, I had to put up with the same behavior I refused to adopt as a student. So I was more than happy to go where I was told such behavior didn't exist. But you, my refuge and my hope, you prodded me at Carthage to leave and enticed me at Rome to come, using the misguided actions of those infatuated with a fleeting life. Some were causing chaos, others were making empty promises, and you used their and my own misguided actions to guide me. Because those who disrupted my peace were blinded by their disgraceful behavior, and those who invited me elsewhere were too focused on worldly things. And me? I was running away from real misery here, only to chase after an illusion of happiness there. God, you knew why I left and where I was going, but you didn't reveal it to me or my mother. She was heartbroken over my departure and followed me all the way to the sea. I tricked her, though, insisting that I had to stay with a friend until he had favorable winds for his voyage. I lied to my own mother and managed to escape. You forgave me for this, mercifully protecting me, despite my terrible actions, from the dangers of the sea. You saved me for your grace, so that when I was cleansed, my mother's tears, which she shed daily for me, would finally cease. Despite my refusal to return with her, I barely managed to convince her to stay the night near our ship at a chapel dedicated to the blessed Cyprian. That night I left secretly while she continued to weep and pray. God, what was she asking with all of those tears, if not to prevent me from sailing? But you, in your infinite wisdom, listened to her deepest desire, not her immediate request, so that you could transform me into the person she always wanted me to be. The wind filled our sails and the shore disappeared from view. The next day she was there, distraught with grief, her complaints and groans filling your ears. You ignored them because through my desires you were pushing me to end all desire. Her earthly love for me was being tested by the pain she was experiencing. She wanted me to stay with her as any mother would, but even more so. She didn't realize the immense joy that you were about to bring her through my absence. She didn't know, so she wept and wailed. Her pain was a reflection of Eve's legacy, seeking in sorrow what she had brought forth in sorrow. But after expressing her anger and disappointment in my deceit and cold-heartedness, she turned again to you, praying for me. She went back to her usual place, and I continued on to Rome. So there I was, struck down by a severe illness, on the brink of death. I was burdened with all the sins I had committed against you, myself, and others, many and serious sins. Plus there was the original sin we all inherit, which leads us all to death in Adam's legacy. You hadn't forgiven me for any of these sins through Christ, nor had he eliminated the hostility I had earned with you through my sins. How could he when I believed him to be merely an illusion? So my spiritual death was as real as I believed his physical death to be fake. And just as his physical death was real, the life of my soul was fake because I didn't believe in it. As my fever worsened, I was on the verge of leaving this world forever. If I had died then, where would I have ended up but in the fiery torment that my sins deserved, according to your divine judgment? My mother didn't know this, but she prayed for me in her absence. You, who are present everywhere, heard her prayers and showed compassion for me. You allowed me to recover physically, even though my heart was still spiritually sick. In my dire condition, I didn't even desire your baptism. I was better off as a child when I had asked my mother to baptize me, as I've previously mentioned and confessed. But I had grown up to my own detriment, and I foolishly mocked your guidance. You, in your wisdom, wouldn't let me die a double death, both physical and spiritual. If my mother had known about this, it would have broken her heart beyond repair. I can't even begin to describe how much she loved me, and how her spiritual anguish for me now was even greater than her physical pain during childbirth. I can't see how she could have healed if my death had pierced the core of her love. And what would have happened to her persistent, never-ending prayers to you alone? But would you, God of mercy, ignore the broken and humble heart of that pure and modest widow, who was so generous in her charity, so dedicated in her service to your saints, never missing a day of offering at your altar, visiting the church twice a day, morning and evening, without fail? She didn't come for idle gossip or old wives' tales, but to hear you in your teachings and for you to hear her in her prayers. Could you ignore and deny the tears of such a woman who asked you not for gold or silver or any temporary or fleeting good, but for the salvation of her son's soul? You who made her who she is? Never, Lord. You were there listening and acting in the order you had planned. It's unthinkable that you would deceive her with your visions and responses, some of which I've mentioned, some that I haven't, which she kept in her faithful heart and constantly brought before you in prayer as if they were your own promises. Because your mercy lasts forever, you grant those to whom you forgive all their debts to also become debtors through your promises. You healed me from that illness and restored the health of your servant's son, so that he could live and receive from you a better and more lasting health. Even then in Rome I associated myself with those deceptive and deceived holy ones, not just their followers, among whom was the person in whose house I felt ill and recovered, but also those they call the elect. I still believed that it was not we who sinned, but some unknown nature within us that sinned, and my pride took pleasure in being blameless. When I did something wrong, I refused to admit it, so that you could heal my soul which had sinned against you. Instead, I like to make excuses and blame some unknown entity within me, which was with me, but wasn't me. But in reality, it was all me. My impiety had caused a rift within me. The sin was even more incurable because I didn't see myself as a sinner. It was a terrible sin that I would rather have you, God Almighty, defeated within me to my own destruction, than myself saved by you. You hadn't yet set a guard over my mouth or a protective barrier around my lips, to prevent my heart from turning to wicked words, to make excuses for sins with those who do wrong. And so, I was still associated with their elect. But now, feeling hopeless about making progress in that false doctrine, I began to take a more relaxed and careless approach to those things. I had decided that if I couldn't find anything better, I would be satisfied with them. I started to think that those philosophers known as academics were perhaps wiser than the rest. They believed that people should doubt everything and that no truth can be fully understood by humans. At least, that's what I thought they meant, and I was pretty convinced that they thought the same way as they were commonly portrayed. However, I didn't hesitate to openly discourage my friend from having too much confidence in the fables found in the books of the Manichaeus. Despite this, I was closer to them than to others who didn't share this heresy. I didn't defend it with the same passion as before, but my association with that sect, many of whom were secretly in Rome, made me hesitant to seek any other way. This was especially true since I had lost hope of finding the truth in your church, O Lord of heaven and earth, creator of all things, visible and invisible. It seemed really inappropriate to me to believe that you could take on the form of human flesh and be limited by our bodily features. Whenever I tried to think about my God, I didn't know what to imagine other than a mass of bodies. Anything that wasn't like this seemed to me to be nothing. This was the main and almost the only reason for my unavoidable mistake. So I used to think that evil was some kind of substance with its own ugly and disgusting form. It could either be solid, which they referred to as earth, or thin and subtle like air, which they thought was some kind of malicious spirit moving through the earth. Because I was religious in my own way, I couldn't believe that a good God would create anything evil. So I imagined two opposing forces, both infinite, but evil being more limited and good being more expansive. This harmful belief led to other disrespectful thoughts. Whenever I tried to return to the Catholic faith, I was pushed away because what I thought was the Catholic faith wasn't actually it. I felt more respectful believing that you, my God, as I confess with your mercy, were limitless in all ways, except where you were up against the mass of evil, where I had to admit you had limits. This seemed better than imagining you to be limited by the form of a human body. I also thought it was better to believe that you didn't create any evil than to believe that the nature of evil, as I imagined it, could come from you. I also believed that our Savior, your only Son, was sent for our salvation from the most brilliant part of your substance. I didn't believe anything about him that I couldn't imagine in my own mind. Given this, I didn't think he could be born of the Virgin Mary without mixing with the flesh, and I couldn't see how what I imagined could mix without becoming impure. I was afraid to believe that he was born in the flesh because I didn't want to believe he was tainted by the flesh. Now your spiritual followers might gently and lovingly laugh at me when they read these confessions, but that's how I used to be. Moreover, I thought the criticisms the Manichaeans had made about your scriptures couldn't be defended. However, I sometimes wished I could discuss these issues with someone who was really knowledgeable about these books, to see what they thought. The words of a man named Hilpidius had started to influence me back in Carthage. He had debated with the Manichaeans face to face, and brought up points from the scriptures that were hard to argue against. The Manichaeans' responses seemed weak to me. They didn't like to give their answers in public, but only in private. They claimed the New Testament scriptures had been corrupted by someone who wanted to impose Jewish law on the Christian faith, but they didn't provide any uncorrupted versions. As for me, my thinking was stuck on physical things. I was weighed down, heavily burdened, and almost suffocated by these masses. I was gasping for the fresh air of your truth, but I couldn't breathe it in its pure and unspoiled form. I started to really focus on the reason I came to Rome, to teach rhetoric. I began by inviting some people to my house, through whom I started to become known. But then I noticed some wrongdoings in Rome that I hadn't encountered back in Africa. Sure, the disruptive behavior of the reckless young men that I'd been warned about wasn't happening. But what I did find was a bunch of students who would conspire to avoid paying their teacher's fees by suddenly switching to another teacher. These people valued money over integrity. I disliked them, but maybe not for the right reasons. I probably disliked them more because their actions affected me personally, rather than because what they were doing was completely wrong. These people are really low. They're unfaithful to you, preferring the fleeting pleasures of the material world and dirty money that taints the hand that holds it. They cling to this transient world, ignoring you who are constant, who call us back, who forgive us when we stray and return to you. Now I really dislike such twisted and corrupt people, but if they were willing to change, I could love them. I hope they come to value their education more than money, and above all, to value you, God. You are the ultimate truth, the source of all good, and the purest peace. Back then, I disliked them more for my own sake rather than wishing them well for your sake. So when the people of Milan had asked the city prefect in Rome to provide them with a rhetoric teacher, and agreed to cover the expenses, I applied for the job. I did this through some friends who were caught up in the Manichaean beliefs that I was about to leave behind, although neither of us knew it at the time. I asked Symmachus, who was the city prefect then, to test me by giving me a topic to discuss, and then send me to Milan. When I arrived in Milan, I met Bishop Ambrose, a man known worldwide as one of the best and a devout servant of God. His powerful speeches were like nourishing food for God's people, providing them with the best of what God had to offer. God led me to him without me realizing it, so that Ambrose could knowingly lead me to God. Ambrose welcomed me like a father, and showed me great kindness when I arrived. From that point on, I started to like him. At first, it wasn't because he was a teacher of the truth. I had given up on finding that in the church, but because he was kind to me. I listened carefully to his sermons, not with the intention I should have had, but to judge his eloquence and see if it lived up to its reputation. I was captivated by his words, but I really didn't care about the content. I was just enjoying the sweet sound of his speech, which was more profound but less charming and melodic than that of Faustus. But when it came to the content, there was no comparison. Faustus was lost in Manichaean fantasies, while Ambrose was teaching the truth about salvation. But I was far from being saved at that time. However, without realizing it, I was slowly getting closer to it. Even though I didn't make an effort to understand what he was saying, I was more interested in how he was speaking. I was just trying to grasp at anything, feeling hopeless about finding a path to you. But as I listened, not only did I pick up the words I wanted to hear, but also the ones I didn't want to. I couldn't separate the two. And while I was acknowledging how eloquently he spoke, I also started to realize how truly he spoke. But this realization came gradually. At first, I started to see that his arguments could be defended. I had previously thought that the Catholic faith had no defense against the objections of the Manichees, but now I started to believe that it could be defended without feeling embarrassed. This change in perspective came especially after I had heard one or two passages from the Old Testament explaining metaphorically, which I had previously understood literally, and it had left me feeling spiritually defeated. After many passages from these books were explained, I started to regret my previous despair, thinking that there was no possible response to those who hated and ridiculed the law and the prophets. However, I still wasn't convinced that the Catholic way was the right one, just because it had knowledgeable defenders who could provide detailed and seemingly reasonable responses to objections. Nor did I think that my current belief should be condemned just because both sides could be defended. To me, the Catholic cause didn't seem defeated, but it also didn't seem victorious yet. So I really focused my mind on trying to find a way to prove the Manichees wrong. If I could have just grasped the concept of a spiritual substance, I could have toppled all their arguments and completely removed them from my thoughts. But I just couldn't. However, when it came to the structure of the world and nature, things that can be perceived by our senses, the more I thought about and compared things, the more I felt the ideas of most philosophers were most likely to be true. So like the academics are believed to do, I questioned everything and found myself torn between all these different ideas. I did, however, decide that I should leave the Manichees because even in my state of doubt, I found some philosophers' ideas more appealing than theirs. But because these philosophers didn't acknowledge the saving power of Christ, I absolutely refused to trust them with the healing of my troubled soul. So I decided to remain a learner in the Catholic Church, which my parents had recommended to me, until I could find something certain to guide my path. That ends this chapter. See you in the next one.